you cannot possibly be surprised it came to this. This time on Poll Hub, Roseanne Barr. She's been way off in conspiracy land on Twitter for years, but finally she went too far, at least for ABC, when she used racially charged language in reference to a former Obama advisor. The network canned her and her show a few hours later, but the bigger story is about race and the ongoing discussion we've been having as Americans. We're going to look at some of the numbers. Then the Associated Press has new guidelines for reporters reporting on and using polls. That's something we know a little bit about. We're going to talk with the AP's polling editor, Emily Swanson, about that. Lots to do. Let's get started. And hi, everybody. This is Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Merengoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
So Roseanne Barr, we're not going to actually talk about Roseanne Barr. We're going to use Roseanne Barr's hijinks here to talk about something that we have talked about a couple times here after Charlottesville. And in a couple of other cases, and that is about race in America, racism, the perceptions of racism, endemic racism, and how this all kind of manifests itself when we look at the polls and how people are thinking about it. And I just want to start by saying that the most striking thing to me is that having worked on, with you, with all of us have worked on the 1968 course that you did. Yep. And looking back at some of the video that we were pulling of Little Rock High School being integrated, and the white students, 16, 17-year-olds, spouting some of the most incredible racial invective and hatred right in the face of African Americans trying to get into the school. The difference between then and now, there's lots of differences, but the generational difference, there was no apparent generational difference in that era, at least in the South and probably in the North too. There was no great generational difference that manifests itself, at least in the way that you saw in these videos.
Yeah,
everything is different now.
Yeah, well, but there's still tons of discrimination. So
there is,
people but the population has shifted. There's no doubt about that.
This divide between how we perceive race and racism really stratifies along age groups pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think you see that, and I don't think people are shocked to know that the millennials, the younger folks, are much more diverse in population and much more open and more tolerant. And as you go up the age scale, it becomes less people of color, whiter, and also more intolerant and more likely to not view this as a big deal, and racism and a whole bunch of other things that go with that.
Well, I think a lot of polls have shown that most Americans feel that we do have a race problem in the United States. Probably, somewhere between a quarter and a third of Americans don't think it's that big of a problem, but everyone else feels that, we have had many instances of, and many examples, particularly over the last several years, of the fact that there is racial discrimination. And Pew Research did a survey, and actually they compiled data over about a year and a half, last year, 2017, and have been doing and asking the same questions through this year as well. And I think they had some really interesting findings. One, which Lee is alluding to, is this generational differences. They looked at the four living generations, of today. So millennials, younger folks, millennials are thought of as people who were born between 1981 and 1996. We're starting to get younger folks who are 18 plus, but they're a generation not yet named.
They don't have a name, so we don't pay attention.
And but also, there aren't, they're about 18 to 22, 18 to 23 right now, so they don't make up a very large proportion of adults right now for us to study as pollsters.
Because the bulk of that generation is actually younger than adult age, so we can't actually poll them. Yeah.
And then we have Gen Xers, the baby boomers who, have been causing trouble for decades now, and then also
we're all boomers, by the way. Everybody
at
the table.
I felt the eyes go in my direction.
No, we're all boomers at this table. So.
And so, what Pew found was very interesting. Now, there's been a change among most of the generations over the last couple of decades, the last 2 decades, and what they found was specifically asking a question about whether they think that the who is responsible or what is responsible for people of color either not getting ahead or having difficulties in society. And so what we've seen is they're given actually two choices. Is it an individual, a personal responsibility? So if someone isn't getting ahead, it's their responsibility because they're not doing so. Or is there something systemic in our society, racial discrimination, that is the main reason why some people may not get ahead? And what we've seen is that number of people who believe that there is a discrimination problem for people of color in our society has grown. Now, that doesn't come as a surprise to people of color. I mean, they've been feeling, this way and understanding and experiencing this, throughout their whole lives. But as a society, I think we have seen a significant change. And one thing is the fact that millennials, a majority of millennials, 52%, actually point to racial discrimination as being a main reason.
And I might interject, and 15 points when you look at the millennials versus white millennials versus Gen X millennials, there's a 15-point difference that the millennials...
The white Gen X.
White
millennials,
with the
white Gen X.
younger whites being much more accepting and thinking that the problem is one of discrimination. So again, it's the age playing a big role here.
And you see that, Gen Xers a little bit less so, but certainly in the same direction. And actually, they're very similar to baby boomers. Statistically, there's not much difference. Still, about 4 in 10 do feel that that is the main reason why people of color may not get ahead, as opposed to other people thinking that it's just one's personal responsibility.
It's kind of funny or ironic that in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, there was talk, pretty much in all quarters about, this is a watershed moment in
post-racial was the word that was used.
Post-racial was tossed around a lot. It's this watershed moment where racism is not dead in America, but we've turned the corner. And whether you want to blame Donald Trump or you want to blame, whoever you want to blame, and there's plenty of people that you probably can blame or groups that you can blame, 2008 seems like a really long way away now. It just seems like we have gone so far in reverse, and the polls in this Pew poll in particular, but other polls seem to suggest that a majority of Americans believe that we've actually kind of pedaled backwards.
Yeah, and I think what we do see, though, is that we see a change generationally. And there's a couple of, I think, reasons for that. One is the fact that younger Americans are just a more diverse generation. If you look at people now, including people under 18 who are under 45, you see that they are actually majority people of color. If you look at millennials, although a majority are white, it's only 56%. So as the next generations are coming of age and moving into adulthood, we're going to see a very different America, and also a change in attitudes, not just because of the fact, though, I don't think, because they are so diverse, but that's now their experience. Their experience is very diverse.
That's one thing. I was having a discussion with somebody about same-sex marriage being maybe the fastest civil right to go from, marching in the streets with a very small percentage of Americans supporting it to Supreme Court ruling to a really large majority now supporting it in this incredibly short period of time. And it's often credited because people came out of the closet, and pretty much every family, somebody knew somebody who was gay in their family, and it's really hard to say to somebody in your family, I'm going to discriminate against you, and so that caused that change. This points to the same thing in a broader scale, but in a probably slower scale, which is that as America becomes really truly more of a melting pot, especially racially, that it's almost impossible for racism in the way we think about it now to continue at the levels that it does, because you're being racist to somebody who's in your family. That's hard. That's a lot harder than somebody you don't know.
Yeah, listen to the numbers and how they've changed. So we look at the silent generation, and the silent generation is 79% white. Baby boomers, 72% white. Gen X, 61%. and millennials, as I mentioned, was 56. And if you look at the generation that's
whatever they're going to be called, right?
Exactly, they're post-millennial right now.
Okay.
They are close to being majority people of color.
So I guess we're saying that in the short term, we've seen some changes in attitudes. In the long term, there look like there's demography and shifts in that are going to increasingly change the attitudes. But also in the short term, we're talking about, as you say, the recent election of Barack Obama, the reaction to that in part by a lot of people, and now we're not sure where that short term is going to go in the midterm elections and the next presidential election, because a lot of the racially charged stuff is still very, very, very dominant.
I think if nothing else, the one thing you can say is that this is not being swept under the rug. Between this particular week, Roseanne Barr, Starbucks closing, all of these different things happening, the conversation's being had. Nobody's hiding it. And if there's a good thing to come out of all this, it's that we're not hiding. We're not pretending that it doesn't exist. We're talking about it, and we're all trying to deal with it.
We're very happy to have joining us right now Emily Swanson, who's the AP polling editor, and she's going to be talking about some new and exciting things that are happening at the AP. But first of all, Emily, thank you for joining us. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your career path to get you to being the AP polling editor?
Sure. So I started out working for pollster.com, which was a poll aggregator then purchased by the Huffington Post. So I worked there for a while. Unfortunately, the pollster piece of things is now largely defunct. But I started working on our own polling there, and from there came over to the AP to do work on our polling.
Okay, great. Now, so the latest edition of the AP Stylebook, which is just out this week, I believe, has a chapter on polls and surveys. Why the edition right now?
Well, so there's been such a proliferation of polls, various types of polls, poll coverage in recent years. It's really easy for that coverage to become sensationalized, and it's a real challenge for journalists to have to try to judge what makes a good poll, judge what makes a good poll story, and especially when we're covering horse race results from individual polls, there's this tendency towards playing up drama, making things look like there are wild swings in the way things are going, or by contrast, like there's a really baked-in narrative about how things are going, as was the case in 2016. And so we just want to make sure that we're covering polls in a smart way and giving our journalists the tools that they need to do that. And also, both the guidance and the ability to take a step back and say, you know what, not every poll is necessarily news, and especially just straight horse race polls, in fact, probably on their own are not news.
So what are some of the key recommendations? It sounds like one of them is the fact that we shouldn't just focus on the horse race.
Yeah, we want to really back off from the horse race being the end all be all of our polling coverage. So one recommendation is that pre-election horse race polls are not on their own a story. They're okay for us to use in context, ideally with more than one poll being cited to kind of give an idea of where a race might stand. But those are more context for other stories about, the state of a race than they are individual stories on their own. Other types of polls having to do with issues or the way people feel about candidates, those can at times make stories on their own, but just the existence of a poll isn't necessarily a story on its own. We also want to provide strong guidance to our journalists in terms of what a poll has to do to merit inclusion in a story. And the big question that we're asking, which all of you are, I'm sure, familiar with, is are the results likely to accurately reflect the opinion of the group being surveyed? So the biggest thing there.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That tends to be the most important thing, and the whole point of having surveys is that somehow they are reflecting more than just the people that we speak with. So, what are some of the things that you think that reporters should be asking of pollsters, and how should they be evaluating a poll that they see?
Well, to start out with, I mean, I think that they need to really ask for disclosure of methods, of the questions being asked, the order of the questions being asked, when the poll was conducted, and all of these kind of go into the judgment call of whether or not to use the poll. Is it timely? Is it sponsored by a group that has a stake in the outcome, in which case it may be that poll has been either selectively released or has questions that have been designed to get a certain type of answer.
Follow the money kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly, because so many polls aren't necessarily specific. They're not trying to necessarily just come into things with an objective outlook on what people's opinions might be, but sometimes they kind of have an agenda that they're trying to push in terms of the story that they're putting out there publicly. And then in general, our guidance is still that the survey should be a random sample of the population, with every member of that population having a known probability of inclusion. So we're looking for, again, in general, probability-based samples of the public. We can talk a little bit more about this if you want to, because we've actually we have opened the door a little bit towards the inclusion of some non-probability-based surveys, but we want to be really careful about when we're using those.
So how do you guide? How do you guide reporters on that? So I was a journalist 25 years, had a style guide on my desk, at all times as you had to. But there's two things that strike me about reporters and polling, and one is the tendency, I think, driven by the need to deliver lots of great headlines, but also lots of stories, to use aggregators. And I'm interested what you think about aggregators, especially having been at one. But the other is this notion of discerning for a reporter between the probability-based surveys, which are the ones that we do here. For instance, at Marist, we use the telephones and cell phones to talk to people, versus the internet ones like SurveyMonkey or some of these others that you get an awful lot of play. You're saying to journalists that it's okay to use those, but with limits. Talk to me about that. And also, I do want to hear about aggregators, because we've had a lot of discussions on this show about that. And the aggregators seem to be a lot of the problems that the image pollsters have had since 2016 come from aggregators and the ratings and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So let's start, I guess, with the non-probability question. So I'll actually say up front, I actually have not approved any non-probability polls for, as of right now, for publication on the wire. But what we're looking for there is, in some circumstances, I think that there's ongoing research into how to use these samples, and there are people who are going about it in a smarter way than others. So if you take this sample that doesn't necessarily start out as super representative of the public, and you're just kind of using simple weights by, gender, race, and age, you're probably not doing a very good job of representing the general public. What we've found, and this has to do with our ongoing research into election day polling, which we'll discuss a little bit later, but we've had some good luck with using probability-based polls to calibrate the results of non-probability-based polls, and we think that there are instances where the combination of the two types of samples or sort of much smarter and more complex weighting techniques can do a better job of representing the public than can just any old online poll.
Yeah, I think was it Harry Entonley who had done some research when I think he was at 538 that basically showed that yes, non-probability surveys can give you some idea of how an election is going, but they do better when they actually have probability surveys to guide them in terms of the demography and in terms of likely voters and those kinds of things that we look at with relation to any kind of an election. Also, just tell us a little bit about, and I don't want to get away from Jay's questions about forecasters, but if you could tell us a little bit about the process by which you guys came to these recommendations, because you're kind of doing a couple things, I think, at once. Changing exit polling for the midterms and doing a lot of research in the combination of probability and non-probability studies with some of our friends at NORC. And I don't know if you've been working with the Pew Research Center as well.
Yeah, so we've been doing kind of ongoing research into various combinations of probability-based and non-probability-based surveys for surveys leading right up and into Election Day as part of our effort to update and replace the traditional exit poll. The challenge there is both getting an accurate look at what the state of the race will be, but also really driving in depth in terms of subgroups and how they're voting on Election Day, and as you know, doing large-scale phone surveys in every single state is a hugely expensive proposition. So the solution that we've struck upon is to do a fairly high quality, we're talking about 1,000 interviews per state, probability-based telephone poll in each state. And we're combining that with these online interviews that give us the ability to really expand the pool of people that we're talking about and then talking to. And then we're combining these two samples in a couple of different ways. We're weighting each of them separately. We're combining them using a calibration weight, which takes into account variables that you don't necessarily have accurate demographic benchmarks for. And then we're also doing some small area modeling that takes advantage of the really large sample sizes that we're able to get. And our experiments with doing that have been extremely successful at accurately representing the population, and have given us a lot of confidence that the combination of those two sample sources and the sophisticated combination of the two sample sources does give us an accurate look at the electorate, both in terms of the overall number and how individual groups are voting.
Yeah, the fun thing about election polling is that we end up having the answer in the end. So unlike other types of polling.
That is always, it's a blessing and a curse.
That's right, exactly.
You know if you did right, and everybody else knows if you did wrong.
So let's go back, Emily, just in concluding about Jay's question about the forecasting, because that was so problematic in many ways in 2016 as we got locked into a narrative when people may not have been able to adequately deal with uncertainty, and people don't necessarily are going to get the notion that 80% probability or chance of someone winning means that it's 1 in 5 they don't. And that kind of gets lost in the excitement of the campaign, particularly if the polls are showing a wide lead with the traditional error margin measurement. So hum us a few bars on how, your take, because you've had an interesting perspective on the forecasters and how we're going to sort of guard against that this time.
And should we pay attention?
Sure. So there are a couple of different things that I would say about that. One is that this sort of goes to our overarching philosophy that we don't want the main focus of our poll coverage to be on the horse race. If we're going to dive in depth on a poll, we'd much rather that it be looking at how people feel about issues, how they feel about candidates, things like that. We don't necessarily think that it's our job to tell people ahead of time who's going to win. Now, we do specifically...
Although that is what everybody wants to know.
It is. I mean, people do want to know it, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that we can't really tell them ahead of time what's going to happen, and all of these polls are just a snapshot in time, and things can change. But you know, I also agree that sometimes these things can kind of lead to a narrative that might or might not end up being true, and people have a hard time reckoning with uncertainty. Now, we do specifically address poll averages in the new Stylebook chapter. We caution that doesn't eliminate error, and that our journalists still need to carefully examine the individual polls that go into that average and whether they're suitable for publication, because we definitely don't want people kind of just throwing everything together and taking that as a replacement for a broader look at what the polls are showing, and the sort of broader context of those polls. I do think that those averages can provide kind of a general sense of how things are going, but we're really looking for people to, at most, use the averages as a starting point and to really take a close look at the individual polls that go into the average.
Yeah, well, I think certainly with the shortage of good quality polls serving this sort of traffic cop function is really going to be very critical as we go into these midterm elections, and we're back in business again with accountability and everything that goes with that. But Emily, thanks so much for joining us today, and good luck in all these ventures. Sounds like you got a lot on your plate.
Thank you, and happy to be here.
Well, that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. We thank Mary Griffith, our executive producer, and we'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades.
And we encourage you to send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu. We'd like to hear from you on whatever's on your mind about possible polling topics, and also maybe even a reaction to what we've been talking about.
And the best way to do that, obviously, Lee, is either at the email address, or also, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, all these places, at Marist Poll. Best way to get questions to us is to send them that way. And our executive producer, Mary Griffith, she monitors those, doesn't she? Yep, gets those questions to us. Also, subscribe wherever you're listening to this. There's a subscribe button. Tap that and tell your friends. Poll Hub, we are on episode 45. I'm not sure we ever thought we'd get this far.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Exactly. See you next time.